Biopsychology, localization of function. So for this subtopic, you need to be aware of the motor cortex, somatosensory cortex, visual and auditory cortex, and the language centres, in particular Broca and Wernicke's area. Now, localization is just the idea that certain parts of the brain, so certain brain regions, are responsible for different behaviours, processes and activities. So in the past it was believed that the whole brain was globally in charge of behaviours, but now through brain imaging techniques it's been discovered that certain parts of the brain are responsible for certain behaviours. Also, the brain is made up of two hemispheres, made up of 4 lobes, and each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. So the left side of the body is controlled by the right hemisphere, and the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. So if we're to look at those 4 lobes, as I said, each hemisphere is made up of 4 lobes. So the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe and occipital lobe. Now, it's important that you know the location of these lobes, because there is questions where you are asked to identify the brain regions in terms of motor cortex, auditory cortex, visual cortex and the parietal lobe. So within the frontal lobe we have the motor cortex. That sends nerve impulses to our muscles, and different parts of the motor cortex control different parts of the body. So the motor cortex in the right hemisphere controls muscles on the left side. The motor cortex in the left hemisphere controls muscles on the right side of the body. Now, temporal lobe is to do with auditory. So that, if we think about where the ear is quite close. So try and remember temporal is at the side where your ears are. So nerve impulses from the cochlea travel via the auditory nerve to our brainstem, and then we decode it, and it continues to the thalamus to the auditory cortex in our brain, in the temporal lobes where the sound is interpreted. Occipital is at the back of our brain, and that is where the visual centre is located. So occipital, a little bit like opticians, to do with sight. So occipital is the visual centre. Nerve impulses from the retina are transmitted via the optic nerve to the thalamus, which relays it to the visual cortex either in the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere. Input from the left visual field, again this is important to remember for split brain research, input from the left of the visual field is transferred to the visual cortex in the right hemisphere. If we're presented information in our right visual field, it is transferred to the left hemisphere. Parietal lobe then is where our somatosensory cortex is located, and that processes sensory information from our skin. So it produces sensation of touch, pressure, pain and temperature, which is then localized to specific body regions. So once again, the somatosensory cortex on the left hemisphere receives information from the right side of the body, and somatosensory cortex on the right hemisphere receives information from the left side of the body. So remember, the hemisphere deals with the opposite side of the body. So language centres are located in the left hemisphere only. Now you need to be aware of Broca and Wernicke's area. So Broca's area, as you can see by the diagram, is located in the back part, the posterior of the left frontal lobe, and it's involved in speech production. Now it was discovered by someone called Brocus, and he studied a patient that he called Tan. Now Tan could understand spoken language, so he could comprehend language, but he couldn't speak or express or produce speech. Now people with damage to Broca's area, or people with Broca's aphasia, lack fluency of speech, and their speech tends to be quite laborious and slow. So they can understand what is being said, but they themselves cannot produce speech in a fluent, coherent way. Now generally they are aware they have this deficit and they become quite frustrated in this. Wernicke's area, as you can see, is located in the back part, the posterior of the left temporal lobe, and that is involved in speech comprehension. So Wernicke studied patients that had lesions, so damage to Wernicke's area, that area of the left temporal lobe, and they were able to speak language. They were quite fluent in their speech, but they didn't understand language. They couldn't comprehend it, so they could produce it fine. Now, people with Wernicke's aphasia often produce nonsense words. So they are fluent in their speech, but their speech doesn't really make sense. They create nonsense words, and they just show that lack of comprehension of what they are saying. So they can produce it, but they produce meaningless nonsense sentences. Now, they are unaware that they are doing so because they can't comprehend speech. So if we were to look at a question, you might get a question like this. This is like a fill in the diagram, complete the diagram of the brain. So it's important that you know where the different centres are located. So if we were to look at this one here, that is our parietal lobe, and that is where the somatosensory centre is located, so D. This bit here, our occipital lobe, and that's the visual centre, so that's C. Here we have our temporal lobe, so that is our auditory, so that is B. This is the frontal lobe, so that would be where the motor cortex or motor centre would be if we were to have to complete that part of the diagram. Now, if you've also looked at other specimen papers, there has been one that you've a multiple choice for each component, and you had to also identify where Brocus and Wernicke's area. So remember, Brocus area is at the posterior of the frontal lobe, which is about here, and Wernicke's area is the posterior of the temporal lobe, so it's about here. So it's very important that you understand where they are located in a brain diagram. Okay, we also have this question. So Lotta's grandmother suffered a stroke to the left hemisphere. It damaged Brocus area and the motor cortex. Using your knowledge of the functions of Brocus area and the motor cortex, describe the problems that Lotta's grandmother is likely to have. Now, Brocus area, remember, is to do with speech production. So therefore, any damage to that means that Lotta's grandmother is going to have difficulty in producing speech. So she will understand speech, her speech comprehension is fine because that's in Wernicke's area, but Brocus area is going to have difficulty producing speech. So her speech is going to be quite laborious, non-fluent, slow, disjointed. We also have the idea that the motor cortex has been damaged. So remember, motor cortex is to do with muscle movement. So she's going to have difficulty moving muscles. Now the key part of this is which hemisphere is the motor cortex damaged in. So it's the left hemisphere that's been damaged, and remember, the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, so it's important to say that her muscle movement on her right side of the body will be damaged, it will be impaired, she might have difficulty moving the right side of her body. So just to look at some evaluations, so there's some supporting evidence from brain scans. So they demonstrate that Wernicke's area was active during a listening task, so a comprehension task, and Brocus area was active during a reading task. So it does suggest that there are different locations for speech comprehension and speech production, so supporting the idea that the Brocus area and Wernicke's area are distinct part of the brain. We also have other ones that from OCD patients that went under a neurosurgical procedure. So it involved lesioning the cingulate gyrus, and in sort of follow-ups they found that they met the criteria for being successful in response to the surgery. So it suggests that that part of the brain was linked to the behaviour of OCD. We've got contradictory evidence though. So Brocus examined the preserved brain of 2 of Brocus patients using MRI scans. So obviously Brocus only had access to post-mortems, but MRI scans could investigate at a deeper level. and they found that other areas were damaged, not just Brocus area. So have we overemphasized the importance of this part of the brain in being responsible for speech production? Is it that actually other parts of the brain are also responsible for speech production? So that would contradict the idea that we have localized areas of function. Also, Lashley removed areas of the cortex within rats, so between 10% to 50%, and they were given the task or given to learn a maze. Now, they found that there was no difference or no area of the brain that was taken out was more important than any other in the ability for the rat to learn the maze. So learning appears to require every part of the cortex, not just a single location. So again, that goes against the idea that we have certain parts, we have that localization of function. If we were to look at a 16 marker, outline and evaluate research into the localization of function. So brief sentence about what localization is. So remember, that's the idea that different parts of the brain are responsible for different behaviours, functions and processes. Mention the four centres. So somatosensory is located in the parietal lobes, to do with the skin picking up sensations like pain, touch, temperature, and each hemisphere controls the different sides. Frontal lobe has the motor cortex, that's to do with muscle movement. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and so on. Temporal lobes are responsible for, has the auditory centre, and that's responsible for interpreting sound. And then the visual centre is located in the occipital lobe, and again, information that comes in from the left visual field is interpreted and sent to the right hemisphere and vice versa. I would then have a second AO1 paragraph that would talk about the language centres, them being only located in the left hemisphere, and the two different ones, Brocus and Wernicke's area, trying to remember that Brocus is in the posterior of the left frontal lobe, and it's responsible for speech production. And if there's damage there, person will be non-fluent in their speech. And Wernicke's area is located in the posterior of the left temporal lobe, and that's responsible for speech comprehension, so they can speak fluently, but the words are, so anyone that's got damage there, or Wernicke's aphasia, speaks fluently, but the words they produce are nonsense, it doesn't make sense. They can't comprehend or understand what is being said. Then 3 to 4 evaluation points, depending on how well you elaborate on them.